Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating and honestly kind of chilling blueprint of how nations actually fall apart from the inside out. We're diving into the theories of Yuri Bezmanov. If you know the space, you know he's the former KGB operative who defected back in 1970. He brought with him the Soviet Union's literal step-by-step method for ideological subversion. And look, whether you're a major history buff or just trying to make sense of the crazy world around us, applying Bezmanov's Cold War-era lens to today's society offers some absolutely incredible insights.
Okay, let's dive into this. Bezmanov made a super specific and really famous assertion. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Now, you might be wondering why that exact time frame, right? Well, according to his framework, that's the minimum number of years it takes to educate one single generation of students and fully expose them to the ideology of the enemy. It's not overnight. It's a slow, generational reprogramming. In his view, once that generation is demoralized, they literally cannot assess true information anymore, even if you shower them with absolute, authentic proof.
To really get a grip on this blueprint, we're going to follow Bezmanov's exact structure today. We'll start with the strategy of subversion, move right into the 6 arenas of demoralization, look at replacing natural human bonds, see how that destabilizes the system, and finally, wrap up with crisis and normalization.
All right, let's kick things off with phase 1, the strategy of subversion. Just to be clear right up front, we are looking at modern societal shifts purely through the impartial lens of this Cold War-era framework, just to see how it maps onto real-world data. When we hear KGB, we usually picture, James Bond-style espionage, spies, stolen nuclear secrets, wiretaps, the whole shebang. But Bezmanov revealed that traditional espionage was actually only about 15% of their resources. The other 85%? That was dedicated entirely to subversion, which in Soviet terminology means a destructive aggressive activity aimed at slowly rotting the enemy's society from the inside. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept. Bezmanov actually compared this ideological subversion to the martial art of judo. Think about it. If a heavier opponent tries to strike you directly, it's painful, and you're probably going to lose if you try to block it with pure force. The judo method says, hey, don't block the punch. You use the enemy's own momentum and guide them right into a wall so they defeat themselves. Every society already has existing cracks, right? Disgruntled groups, criminals, extreme idealists. Subversion simply finds those exact cracks, amplifies them, and lets the society basically tear itself apart. Moving on to phase 2, the 6 arenas of demoralization. This is really the first active phase, and Bezmanov actually claimed that in the West, this demoralization process was already overfulfilled. Subversion is highly, highly targeted. He identified 6 core arenas where a society essentially decides what it believes. We're talking religion, education, social life, power structure, labor relations, and law and order. The strategy is to systematically erode accepted norms in these specific spaces. And honestly, what Bezmanov couldn't have possibly predicted was the internet, where algorithms and massive tribal reinforcement are accelerating this decay way faster than at any point in history. Let's zoom in on that power structure arena using some modern data. Bezmanov warned that natural administrative bodies would be swapped out for artificial, unelected groups who completely monopolize public opinion. And think about today. Just 6 mega corporations control roughly 90% of what Americans read, watch, and hear. A tiny handful of tech algorithms dictate what goes viral and what just disappears. Back in the Soviet era, state messaging was super obvious propaganda. But today, these unelected corporate bodies hold immense power, and people generally walk around believing they're forming their own completely independent opinions. We're seeing a very similar shift in the religion arena. Bezmanov's formula was to ridicule established religious dogmas and replace them with fragmented alternative faiths, or, frankly, fake organizations. Over just the last 2 decades, regular church attendance in the U.S. dropped from 42% down to 30%. But meanwhile, the broader wellness industry, crystals, alternative spirituality, astrology, has absolutely exploded into a $1.5 trillion global market. To put that into perspective, the overarching community purpose of traditional religion is basically being scattered into billions of isolated, highly consumer-driven spiritualities. That brings us to phase 3, and a major focus for us today. Replacing natural human bonds. This societal fragmentation leads us right into the absolute core of Bezmanov's theory, the systematic replacement of natural human bonds. He argued that a truly healthy society relies on direct, organic links between individuals, but subversion actively rips those out and replaces them with artificial, bureaucratic structures.
So instead of neighbors just resolving local issues together, you introduce a middleman, like a social worker or an NGO. Instead of direct negotiation, you inject a third force, like a trade union boss. And because these middlemen are driven by payroll, their main concern naturally becomes preserving their own bureaucratic power, which just divides people into competing grievance groups.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly this warning maps onto our modern economy. We see this third force inserting itself literally everywhere. Think about it. A landlord has an apartment. You need a place to live. Pretty simple, right? Well, today, a rental agency sits right in the middle and extracts a commission. A local restaurant makes food, you want to eat it. Boom! A delivery app sits in the middle and takes a massive 30% cut, driving up the cost for everyone. The middleman essentially becomes impossible to remove.
And we see it happening in healthcare too. A doctor wants to treat you, but an enormous insurance company stands between you, dictating the treatments and the costs. You know, we were all told the internet was going to decentralize society and totally eliminate middlemen. Yet, if you look at the data between 1999 and 2010, the economic footprint of middlemen in the US actually grew from a quarter to more than a third of the entire GDP. We are just becoming increasingly alienated from direct human exchange. This alienation really compounds in the labor relations arena. $3.3 trillion. That is the amount of US dollars the Federal Reserve created in 2020 alone. Just a number magically typed on a screen, and the result? 9% inflation, the highest we'd seen in 40 years. Bezmanov noted that even when workers go on strike and win, say, a 10% raise, they still actually lose because inflation and lost time completely outpace their gains. The distance between what things cost and what average people actually earn just keeps growing wider, breeding this deep systemic resentment. And man, that resentment is heavily fueled by debt. We're talking $57 trillion in global consumer debt in 2024. That's an astronomical number. Bezmanov specifically pointed out how advertising agencies make people believe they constantly need more. Just look at your phone. Every modern app uses countdown timers and manufactured urgency to make you borrow money to buy things you didn't even know you needed 15 seconds ago. The system just makes this endless, exhausting cycle of debt and consumption feel completely normal. Which leads us into phase 4, destabilizing the system. So once a society is fully demoralized, drowning in debt, and stripped of its natural bonds, the timeline shifts dramatically into the rapid phase, destabilization. This is where constructive compromise completely dies. Radicalization just takes over. To look at this purely through Bezmanov's framework, we can observe recent events. Take the 2020 defund the police movement, where budgets were stripped, which was followed by a documented rise in crime. Or look at media platforms glorifying serial killers while actively eroding trust in traditional law enforcement. Even in everyday life, a simple fender bender in a parking lot suddenly escalates into a massive public tribal scandal. There's just no middle ground anymore, only sides. And finally, phase 5, crisis and normalization. Let's move to and see how this builds, because when compromise becomes impossible, society simply stops functioning, bringing us to the final stages of the subversion funnel. We go straight from destabilization into crisis. In a crisis, an exhausted, paralyzed population just wants someone, anyone, to fix it. They actively search for a savior, usually a strongman or a highly centralized government who promises to restore order. And once that savior takes power, we enter normalization. Now, Bezmanov notes this is a deeply ironic Soviet term. It was famously used when tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush protests. Normalization doesn't mean returning to normal. It means stabilizing the country by absolute force. And here is honestly the darkest twist in the entire blueprint. Once normalization happens, these self-appointed rulers no longer have any use for radicalism. So what actually happens to the idealists, the social workers, and the passionate activists who helped destabilize the system in the first place? Well, according to Bezmanov, they are physically eliminated. The revolution consumes its creators. The new rulers know for a fact that anyone who helped create chaos once can easily turn around and do it again. So they are always the very first to be removed. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. If the passionate activists and the architects of chaos are merely pawns, destined to just be swept away the exact moment the new system stabilizes, who is really in control? As we look around today at the growing bureaucracies, the expanding middlemen, and the deep divisions in our modern arenas, Bezmanov's Cold War blueprint really challenges us to objectively evaluate the shifting structures around us. Are the cracks in our society simply widening on their own, or are we being carefully guided right into the wall? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning what you see out there.